in the year of Iris Murdoch's 100th birthday, I think it's easier to see her as a young woman than it has been for many years. To explain perhaps what I mean, I went the other day when HMV declared bankruptcy protection to buy some DVDs, and I saw a box of Gérard Depardieu classics. How young he looks, I thought, with some surprise, seeing the youthful picture on the front. I'd always thought of him as a good chunk older than myself. And then I saw Henry Fonda, a Jean-Louis Trintignant, who had reached adulthood many years earlier. They looked neither old nor young, just figures from another age, unconnected with the passage of age in my own life. Iris Murdoch is now, for many, a person from another age. Perhaps paradoxically, this means we can see her now, not from the present looking backwards, but from her own time looking forwards. Murdoch is no longer only, or first, the grand author of many novels, famous for the clutter of her house, her no longer progressive social views, and the film-worthy onslaught of Alzheimer's disease. She can be, instead, the brilliant young philosopher, the Oxford critic of Weil's behaviorism about the mind, the admirer of Wittgenstein who found that his followers, and more dangerously the linguistic philosophers who might seem to have been his natural heirs, had, above all in moral philosophy, travestied Wittgenstein's own injunction to respect the diversity of phenomena. The philosopher who wanted to achieve a kind of renewal of British philosophy by making it, I think, more European, but who found that, looking at figures in Europe, it was not Sartre who she'd first been caught by, but Weil, who seemed the best guide. And incidentally, I think a philosopher who also turned us from the empiricism of Hume to the empiricism of Hegel. But on this occasion, I'm going to be talking about Murdoch in relation to Simone Weil. And I'd like to start with a sentence that is deleted from the published edition of The Sovereignty of Good as a book, but which appeared in the first printing of it in, I think, the Chicago Review in 1964. It says, just at the end of the first paragraph, "When we move from reading R.M. Hare to reading Simone Weil, we seem to enter a different world. We can scarcely, as philosophers, be content to say, this is just another kind of stuff. But when we try to reflect upon a possible relationship, we find ourselves sadly short of instruments." Now, I'm not particularly going to be taking the risk of providing the instruments that we really need, but it seems to me quite important to think of how Murdoch was most immediately, I think, concerned with Hare and Weil as immediate reference points in that relatively early essay. She later deleted those sentences, and one might ask, why did she delete them? I have a sneaking suspicion that it may have been because she'd so completely lost patience with Richard Hare. He had been the object of some quite worked out challenges that she'd presented in an Aristotelian Society symposium in, I think, 55, 56. And he had made no response in print at all. He seems over and over again to have paid incredibly little attention in philosophical debate to her views. And I think in a way she may simply have just thought, look, I'm tired of this right now. I'm not going to identify him as a reference point if he doesn't pay any attention to me. Now that's pure speculation on my part. Actually, it's not pure speculation, but it's, you know, of course, not in the domain of knowledge. It's in the domain of, you know, outrage, I don't know, not outrageous opinion, but loose opinion, but I hope not totally loose. What might one say about Hare, just very briefly, to establish him as one of the reference points that she will be defining herself against? I think it's helpful, perhaps, to take a second look at something that some of the people writing about Hare have particularly highlighted as a kind of central and, from some point of view, highly admirable aspect of his thinking. Hare had been a prisoner of war of the Japanese after the fall of Singapore in 1942, right to the end of the war. And one of his obituary writers, Christopher Taylor, has said he was conscious of attempting to develop a system which should serve as a guide in the harshest conditions. Now, I think it was a matter of pride on his part to try to come up with a philosophy that could defend itself, so to speak, against those people who, from some point of view, one had least in common with. But a philosophy designed to capture what can be said under the most extreme circumstances to those with whom, in a sense, one has the least common ground, may not be the circumstances most propitious to examining what the soul is capable of in its highest and most unusual activity. It may actually demand a certain protection, a certain surrounding by certain, so to speak, congenial, similarly trained, etc. spirits for the soul to be capable of that kind of expansion. So I think it's sort of interesting that, I mean, it's not accidentally linked with that Hare's philosophy centers around these maximally non-specific words like good and right, whereas Murdoch's concentrates so often upon the frankly perspectival terms like flighty and snobbish and repentant, the terms which Bernard Williams would later associate with thick moral concepts. But now, back to Simone Weil. There are quite a lot of explicit references to Simone Weil in the course of the main articles of Iris Murdoch, but I'm going to look very briefly at, actually not as briefly as all that, but at least I'm going to look at Murdoch as she encountered Weil in a work that she later seems to have half forgotten about. In I think it was October 1951. She gave a review on the third programme of the BBC of Simone Weil's book Waiting on God, which was just being published in an English translation. A little later, I mean some years later, she reviewed the two-volume notebooks, 1956, for The Spectator. Now, whatever, some 8 years or so later, or maybe later even than that, she was asked, you know, does the Bell particularly show the influence of Simone Weil? And she said, I'm not even sure that at the time when I was writing the Bell, I'd read Simone Weil, in the way at least that I came to. Now, of course, she had at the time when she was writing the Bell actually reviewed close on 1,000 pages of Simone Weil. So the thought that she'd sort of quite possibly not read her at all was in some ways not superficially a truth. What I think might nonetheless be true is that the impact of Simone Weil only developed itself over the years after 1956-57. I think Simone Weil left a number of seeds that didn't mean much, didn't grow very strongly in the ground that they'd been put in right away, but as the ground changed during the later 50s, Murdoch was in a position to make use of that material quite differently. But now, what was that material? I'll say a bit about the spiritual autobiography that constitutes, I don't know, nearly 20 pages of Waiting for God. Sorry, it's called Waiting for God in the American edition. It's called Waiting on God in the English, British publication. The French, of course, is Attente de Dieu. Curiously enough, in the preface to both editions, the publishers say, we're delighted to be able to give it the title in English that we give it. And the title is different in the two places. So you wonder what on earth they were doing. But that's a mystery that I guess would have been easier to solve 30, 40 years ago. There would have been people to ask. And now I'm afraid I don't know, though I hope there might be somebody here who can tell me. So in the spiritual autobiography, we will find a lot of very important notions at work that will play a large role in Murdoch too. Obedience, the notion of action, without there being room for a choice. The perfect condition that one should hope for is that where it is so clear what one ought to do that one can act immediately, and one acts not from effort of the will, but, at least in Simone Weil, with a kind of desire, which I think may be a word which comes to mean something a little like joy in doing it. You just think, yeah, it's the thing to do. You do it desiringly. That doesn't particularly carry over into Murdoch. I mean, it's not that it gets repudiated, but it just doesn't particularly figure. Then there is a notion of affliction that comes to play a very large role in Simone Weil that isn't explicitly thematized by Murdoch, but which I think nonetheless actually plays a role. Or rather, something like it plays a role. So let me give you a kind of sketch of the spiritual autobiography. It constitutes the fourth of a number of letters to Father Perrin, dating from about 1942 May, possibly the 15th of May, written in Marseille before she will embark to go to Casablanca and then to New York and then finally to England. There are, in a way, two particular movements within the work. It contains a description of a kind of spirituality that she found herself just waking up to in her adolescence and then more intensely later. And then there's the question why she still held back from the church. So in her adolescence, she saw the problem of God, she says, in early adolescence, as a problem of which the data could not be obtained here below. So she says she left it alone, neither affirming nor denying anything. She didn't allow herself to think of a future state, but did think of the instant of death as the center and object of life. A moment where pure truth enters the soul, and all of life, which for her would have the character of a vocation, was leading to that point. Hence, she says, her conception of obedience, that is, obedience to the vocation that would lead to the great crucial moment of pure truth, that of death. And the most beautiful life possible has always seemed to me, she said, to be one where everything is determined, either by the pressure of circumstances or by impulses such as I've here mentioned, that is, vocation or seeing what is required for you, and where there is never any room for choice. But she describes how at the age of 14 she fell into a despair and thought of dying because of the mediocrity of my natural faculties, particularly by contrast with her brilliant mathematician brother. But after months of inward darkness, she had the conviction that no matter what a human being, no matter which human being can penetrate to the kingdom of truth, if only he longs for it and perpetually concentrates his attention upon its attainment. The notion of concentration of attention will also be one that will play more systematic importance in the philosophical development by her and will be carried over in Iris Murdoch's work. She persevered for some 10 years in an effort of concentrated attention. And she says this was joined with the conviction that when one hungers for bread, one will not receive stones. At least that is in the realm of spiritual goodness, but not elsewhere. Now, she adds that as far as she can always remember, I mean, as far back as she can possibly remember, she had always had the spirit of poverty in her. She fell in love with St. Francis and hoped that fate and force would force in her the condition of a beggar and a vagabond. And she's going to think of that as actually epistemically, and yes, it's going to be epistemically important for bringing us to a proper understanding of, in some sense, the supernatural condition of human beings, the condition that Kant would call our übersinnliche Natur, our possession of an übersinnliche Natur. She also talks of the love for one's neighbour, and that is for fellow human beings, and of the way the idea of purity took possession of her at about the age of 16. But then there are a couple of exceedingly remarkable sentences. She says, first, I knew quite well that my conception of life was Christian. She adds, that is why it never occurred to me that I could enter the Christian community. She means exactly what she said. It never occurred to me that I could enter the Christian community. She's going to have criticisms of the community and explain why she had to hold herself outside. She did think that she was herself born within it, but she said to add dogma to that conception of life would seem a lack of honesty. Nonetheless, she describes 3 fantastically intense contacts with Catholicism that marked her. One was from her work in the factory of Renault cars. She talks of how the affliction of others entered into my flesh and my soul. She said she felt so marked that to this day, when any human being speaks to me without brutality, I cannot help having the impression that there must be some mistake. She felt she had received the mark, like a brand in Roman times, of a slave. But in that condition, she said she was in Portugal, taken there at a time when she'd been particularly low, and entered a little village on an evening with a full moon, and the wives of the fishermen in procession were visiting ships, singing ancient hymns. And she says there came upon her the sudden conviction that Christianity is preeminently the religion of slaves, that slaves cannot help belonging to it, and I among others. The notion of slavery here, I think, does play a very important role. The slave is, in later essays made clear, to be one who is treated in some degree as a thing, regarded by his master as a thing. And she talks of how even in the condition of an afflicted slave, there can be the one who speaks to the slave. She says actually treating him as an equal while realizing that there is, in fact, no equality of power. And that produces a gratitude in the slave. It's a generosity in the aggressor, and there is a gratitude which he thinks is justified because there is something actually beautiful in the action and attitude of the one thus speaking. And she says it's only in the condition of that that you can find, so to speak, a true justice being done. But this is also to be epistemically important in making one aware of what she will call, let me see, the supernatural generosity and the supernatural gratitude on the part of the 2 agents in this. Now, I actually think that supernatural does not need to mean here so to speak, involving a transcendent God standing, or a transcendental being standing outside the world. I think this stands in a tradition with Kant's talk of our supersensible nature, something which is more than a matter of the feeling that comes to us just through our sensory condition. And in large part, I think this actually coincides with Plato in his conception of what the higher parts of the soul. I don't mean absolutely coincides, I mean there's a structural parallelism with Plato in his emphasis upon what the higher parts of the soul, as opposed to the lower parts of the soul. I mean, sensation is an activity of the lowest part of the soul. It's the soul that does it. It's not, in some sense, merely a bodily thing, but it's a very different part of the soul from the one that's capable of engaging in reflection upon the justice and injustice of things, and so on. And I think this is now to anticipate the sort of general theme that I haven't yet made a sort of large statement of. It is that I think it was Simone Weil who, when Murdoch encountered her, was able to sow the seeds of a recognition that a kind of genuinely just and in some sense religiously imprinted philosophy was compatible with Plato. She'd read Plato long before as an undergraduate. She'd found him kind of unbearable, full of rhetorical tricks, and she'd heard some good people giving lectures. I mean, Ian Dodds, for example, who produced the edition of the Gorgias, had lectured on the Phaedo, and she quite possibly also heard his lectures on the Symposium and the Phaedrus. But when she read the Republic, she really reacted with some aggression. And I think it's particularly interesting to remember or notice the words that she came up with at that time. Now, here's a question. Can I find them? Can I find them? What she said was something like, does he know what it's like working in a factory? Does he know what the men in the mines experience? And what about in a cotton mill? Now, that's not a straight quotation, but you will find, if you want, I mean, maybe I'll find it later when I move forward. But I find it quite interesting that that is her response to Plato, specifically to Plato, and then she will find in Simone Weil a person who can show her that one can be an admirer and a user and a builder upon Plato, and at the same time feel there is nothing more informative than about the ultimate nature of human beings and so on, than the interactions that take place between a person who has suffered affliction and a person who actually recognizes the full human character of that person. Now, Murdoch continues by thanking Father Perrin. She mentions she mentions two important other moments of spiritual expansion in her, but I won't dwell on those. And she thanks Perrin, but she has to explain why she will stand outside the church. And she says the fundamental reason is that the Catholic Church is not genuinely Catholic, meaning, I think, by that total or whole. So many things, this is now a quotation, so many things are outside it. So many things that I love and do not want to give up. So many things that God loves. Otherwise, they would not be in existence. All the immense stretches of past centuries, except for the last 20, are among them. all the countries inhabited by coloured races, all secular life in white people's countries. In the history of these countries, all the traditions banned as heretical. Given that those things are placed outside the church, she says she will remain outside. She says, nonetheless, of course, it is our duty, of course for her, it is our duty to show the possibility of a truly incarnated Christianity. But for that, she says, Christianity would need to become truly Catholic. Our true, and there's a certain amount more that I should mention, our true destiny is not to be parts of a collective church, but rather in the perfection of the condition where Christ lives in us. And she emphasizes how true intelligence requires total liberty without domination. Now, I am particularly struck with how Murdoch, reviewing the book in which this is the central declaration of, so to speak, who she is. There's much later which is more conventionally philosophical, but it's not so conventionally philosophical. These are manuscripts that were not designed, like some of the earlier published work, for an ordinary philosophical or more general literary audience. They're written in some cases for groups of people with spiritual interests, and so they don't have the same style. But so I'm struck by, I think the echo that Murdoch finds in the presentation of Simone Weil seems to me to run on many different levels. Those who know Murdoch at all well will recognize how the moral psychology is very largely carried over into Murdoch's work. I'm thinking here the idea that will is not the crucial notion, it's a kind of perception of what is demanded, that there is a moral reality external to ourselves, we must pay attention to it till that point, ideally, if we're lucky enough, where it would become just straightforwardly clear what one should do, and then she thinks action will follow. There's a moment where she talks of, I don't know, the Good Samaritan who sees the person in the ditch and just thinks, this is a human being like me, and just does what is called for. He says action just straightforwardly follows. This will impress itself upon Murdoch. But I actually think that there is some parallel, I don't quite know exactly how much to make of it, between the sort of social conditions of the two of them. Simone Weil felt herself intensely to be an outsider, but of course she had said that she felt herself to have been born into Christianity, and then she was the one who said, right, but I'm going to put myself outside. She was, in fact, fantastically well inserted into French society from some point of view. She was a normalienne. You think of Iris Murdoch as a brilliant student in Oxford, and then you think of how, at least I think of how, in some degree, I think she made herself something of an outsider. It seems to me that it's worth seeing, a number of factors here. One which in some sense is of great importance, and there are other things that in another sense are more particular to her. But the first one is, of course, the situation of women in Oxford, which changed tremendously during the time when she was an undergraduate and during the time after she returned. There's been quite a lot of attention paid to what it was like being a student at the time, and people have talked about the scarcity of men within the student body. I think it's worth noting that she got both the time when I think there were something like 6 times as many men, 6 times as many men as there were women in the university, and then the time where the women were in the, I think probably just about in the majority. I'm not absolutely sure, but here are some quite striking facts about what it was like by the time you got to 1942 and Philippa Foot and Iris Murdoch were taking schools or finals. Philippa Foot got a first in PPE, and all of the firsts were awarded to women. All of the third-class degrees that year, all of the fourth, I don't know if there were any third-class degrees, there were several fourth-class degrees, and they were all given to men. The men were in short supply, and they were not as impressive as all that. And that's not just true in PPE. I looked at a couple of other subjects in mathematics. The women did notably better than the men did. I mean, both at the very top, the only distinction was given to a woman in that year. Distinction, I think, in differential geometry, I remember. And the men, on average, did worse than the women in mathematics. But I think, in a way, something which people haven't paid a lot of attention to is what it must have been like when the men started coming back. Murdoch had been appointed at St. Anne's in 48, and the men started coming back in increasing numbers just about then. And I think of how she might have thought, oh, well, I'm sort of in my element. I can sort of do what I'm just one among equals. And then she might quite quickly have discovered that, no, she was not one among equals. They'd come to decide that things would be run really rather differently. And in particular, I think of 2 things that sort of mark the beginning and the end of her teaching time in Oxford. Probably the first doctoral thesis that she supervised was of a person who, when it was submitted, had it referred back to him for revisions. This was a person, I'm terribly sorry, I actually don't know his work at all, so it'll take me a second to just, let me see. No, I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, actually, no, anyway, the first writer, he was referred. The last was Miklos Veto, who was writing, in fact, on Simone Weil. And when he presented his doctorate, that was referred, that is, failed. I mean, effectively sent back for, if this is to be passed, it's going to have to be corrected quite fundamentally. It must have been upsetting for virtually your first and virtually your last thing to be rejected by your fellows. The first candidate didn't revise the material and later received an honorary doctorate from the Université de Paris 10. The last, Miklos Veto, went on to quite a most distinguished philosophical career. He published the book on Simone Weil. It was a year later represented and was passed. But you just think how this might have affected a person teaching. I mean, you might just feel it's hard, it just becomes noticeable that the way you do things and the way your colleagues do things can only be different. Now, I also think, as a philosopher, Murdoch was quite noticeably constantly looking outside what was in the immediate environment. I mean, I'm quite struck, over and over again she does this. She turns up in Cambridge saying she wants to write a doctorate on Husserl. Now, there weren't many people in Cambridge in 1947 who really had much to say about Husserl. She dropped the idea fairly quickly, but it was clearly I say clearly, who am I to say? But I think there's at least some attraction to the view that this is her saying, we have to do better than this, and saying, where can I go to get renewal? And looking first there. Then a little earlier, she will have reached for Sartre. I mean, she met Sartre, let me see, something like 45 or 46 in Belgium, and she found it immensely exciting. She ended up writing a book on Sartre. She doesn't in the end think he is going to lead her to the truth. So she continues her search. And I think on finding Simone Weil, she really did think, in some sense, I found the thing that sort of pulls a few things together. Now, I don't think she thought that initially. When she reviewed Waiting on God for the third programme, she regarded it as a little bit strange, but she had great admiration for it. When she reviews the journals, I mean the notebooks for The Spectator in 1956, she summarizes from Simone Weil almost exactly views that she will adopt into her own philosophy. I'll give you a quick paraphrasing of them. Good is a transcendent reality, and good and evil are connected with modes of human knowledge. For example, the good person is one who knows or sees things as they are in their moral and other aspects. The soul has higher and lower parts, and until we become good, we are at the mercy of mechanical forces, the forces of automatic nature, of which gravity or heaviness is the general image. We are weighed down by those parts of our nature. And these forces are, as psychoanalysis indeed says, only darkly understood by us. There's something in Plato about that too, of course. Now, to resist gravity or heaviness is to suffer the void, to endure, and to hold back from filling a certain kind of vacuum in our existence. And this is a task that human beings can perform only with the aid of grace, a kind of supernatural assistance that answers a certain kind of call in us if we are blessed. Now, progress in morality is more a matter of meditation than of action. Murdoch will later talk of the moral character of our consciousness and of states of mind, whereas, of course, Hare had emphasized action as what truly reveals the principles of a man. Now, when we direct our attention to the good, it excites love in us, though we recognize we are ultimately incapable of attaining it. Suffering purifies only to the extent that it is pure affliction. That's the special condition of one who is almost on the point of abandoning their own humanity, but yet will find from outside a recognition of the capacity that they have, which in turn revives that almost nearly extinct spark. Yet the sufferer is in danger of seeing in suffering an imaginary consolation. Consolation is something we must be suspicious of. And finally, our ideal, as I've said, is to pay attention to the reality outside us to such a point where we no longer have choice of what to do. Now, all of that is from Murdoch's summary, I mean it's my paraphrasing, but of Murdoch's summary of Simone Weil. And anybody who knows Iris Murdoch will be well aware that it pretty much reappears in Murdoch's own work. At the same time, I want to say it is reframed in an utterly different way. Murdoch will rework that material for a world without God. I actually think she doesn't, in the first of the three essays of The Sovereignty of Good, she doesn't claim there is no God, but she takes it as something she doesn't want to place any dependence upon. On God and Good and in The Sovereignty of Good, she actually makes it an assumption, which doesn't mean a dogma, but just something that she will take to be true of the main argument of On God and Good and of the other paper. There is no God. So what can one make of the, so to speak, highly God-saturated existence and philosophy of Simone Weil? How can she take it over to such an extent? The answer, I think, is that, the answer is in what we see, what we know as On God and Good, the second essay of The Sovereignty of Good. That's an essay which will say that the role that was played by God in a theistic world picture can, in fact, in large part, she doesn't want to say totally, be played by the good. It is, and gosh, let me see. Yep. There are, let me see. It's going to take me 1 second to find, yep. Yes, both God and good can be characterized as an object of attention, unitary, transcendent. The special meaning attached to that will emerge in her paper, perfect and necessary and real. Now, all of those are characteristics of God. They're also characteristics of the good. She wants to say, even in the absence of God, one can be motivated by the good. Now, that will lead there to a new picture of human personality. That is, actually, that's an interesting word, human personality. We today find it hard, I think, to hear the word in the way that she intended it. Human, she means personhood, what it is to be a person. What is human personality? It's what is being a person. And personality, in that sense, is something actually that will be a central object of attention for Kant, Persönlichkeit. And in many ways, the supersensible nature of the person as we find it in Kant will parallel the activity of the higher parts of the soul in Plato, and it will parallel what we find in Murdoch. Parallel what we find in Weil with the supernatural generosity and the supernatural gratitude that's found in the nexus of affliction met by the genuinely human gaze. So in some sense, I think Murdoch achieved a kind of a homecoming when she found Weil. It managed to, it was not quite the Weil that Weil had presented, because God was going to be not quite written out of the script, but the role was going to be rewritten in such a way that she was going to find the whole thing rather easier to swallow. Indeed, it was not just going to be easy to swallow, it was something she'd long swallowed. She, in a certain sense, I think, kept finding that as she developed what seemed to her own ideas, suddenly she could say, oh, I think that was in Plato. Now, she was remembering Plato because, of course, as a student, she had studied Plato and she'd had to teach Plato, and she'd rejected what she had been exposed to over and over again. But once she found it out for herself, she was able to say, oh yeah, not so bad after all. Perhaps that's just what we need. I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.